Greetings. My name is Peter Krause. I'm an associate professor of political science at Boston College and a research affiliate in the MIT Security Studies program. As many of you know, I've been conducting a series of talks on Israeli and Palestinian history and politics and present-day current events. As you can see here on the screen, this is the third in the most recent talk series. Today's focus is on the struggle over normalization and the future of American Arab-Israeli relations in the MENA region. If you are interested, I've done two prior talks over the past couple months. One was on September 11th on the US election. Obviously, we've now seen the outcome of that election, and President Trump is going to be president again. But nonetheless, in that talk, I walk through President Trump's likely foreign policies in the Middle East alongside Vice President Harris's potential foreign policies in the Middle East. So can still learn a lot for what may be coming in a new Trump administration. And then about a month ago, I did a talk called Words Matter, understanding how Palestinians and Israelis define, use, and react to charged words like terrorism, settler, intifada, and peace. So if you're interested in how you can have potentially more constructive conversations about these very sensitive issues, but also understand the importance of language and how different ways people define and utilize and react to some of these terms. That's a great one for you. And again, there are recordings with the MENA MIT organization. So if you reach out to them, you can access those recordings. This is a recording that I am doing on this other talk. I ran the talk a day or two ago with a great audience. We had a lot of great questions. So this is me recording the talk subsequently for those of you who are not able to attend. So again, as I mentioned, that's the topic of today, struggle over normalization, and I'll define what that means in just a moment. But in a basic sense, we're talking about normalized foreign relations between Israel, surrounding Arab states, and the United States. So right off the bat, what are some of the things that we think about when we think about these issues? Obviously, relations between the United States, between Israel, and between countries in the broader Middle East, North Africa region, perhaps most prominently these days, Saudi Arabia, because Saudi Arabia is both one of the most important political, economic, military actors in the region, longtime U.S. ally, has been pretty favorably inclined towards Israel in the past, especially decade and a half. But they do not have formal recognition of or relationships with Israel. Under the Biden administration, there were significant diplomatic efforts undergone to get normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia after October 7th and the subsequent war. That was kind of put more on the back burner, but the Biden administration nonetheless pursued a U.S.-Saudi relationship that would have been much more advanced. And then the idea was that Israel would join later. In any case, it doesn't seem like that will happen before the Biden administration leaves office, but the Trump administration will certainly try to push something similar. President Trump signed and pushed the Abraham Accords in 2020. Having the Saudis join that would be the crown jewel in many ways, because Saudi Arabia is obviously way more politically significant than the Emirates or Bahrain or Morocco or Sudan. And at the same time, I think the current Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu would like to have a normalization deal with Saudi Arabia very much. However, the cost of how to achieve that and whether that could be achieved in the current political climate is going to be one of the key focuses of what we'll talk about today. So again, these are the types of issues we're talking about when we mean normalization. But let's just take a step back for a moment and say, okay, what exactly is meant by this term? When we use the term normalization, what do we mean? So in the most basic sense, normalization is when we're establishing normal diplomatic relations between countries. So what does that mean? It means that you actually recognize the other country's existence, its legitimate sovereign control over the territory that it controls. You recognize its government as a legitimate government, not some foreign government that says, oh, we're actually the true government of country X. You usually exchange ambassadors. So you have an ambassador from your country and their country's borders and from their country within your borders. And then you don't have to do this, but normally it often means that there is travel and trade that is enabled, and then again can go to varying degrees. So you can have a lot of travel of people across borders or a little bit. You could have extensive trade or not so extensive, but you at least allow that to happen and make it legal and okay. When you do each of those things, that's generally what we refer to as normalizing relations. And you might think, okay, well, most countries in the world seem to have normalized relations, right? You can travel there, they can travel to your country, etc. But as we probably know, in the broader Middle East, normalization is not something to be taken for granted. In fact, it's been the crux in many ways of the broader Arab-Israeli conflict for nearly the past century. So when we think about normalization or we think about peace, it's important to also think about how it has multiple dimensions, right? So on the one hand, formal normalization is like here, yes or no, do you have political peace? Do you have handshakes between presidents? But there's also kind of this interpersonal piece, and maybe that's more whether people actually are traveling between countries. There is extensive trade between the countries. There is there are decent feelings of support between the populaces of those two different countries. So when we look at, possible combinations, we can say, okay, on the one hand, maybe there's warm peace in some scenario, like France and Germany. They fought multiple wars against each other, not including World War I and World War II, and yet today, extensive travel and peace between there, extensive trade, no idea in anyone's mind that there's going to be another shooting war between France and Germany in our lifetime. So that would be the definition of a warm peace. There are no relations with Israel and its neighbors that fit under that rubric. I think the closest one in some ways would be the United Arab Emirates, which just signed a normalization deal with Israel 4 years ago in 2020. There is, as I'll show you, greater trade with the UAE than any of the other Arab countries that Israel has signed a peace deal with. There is some travel between the countries, greater plane flights than there used to be. There's some cultural exchange, but still, I don't think we're to the point of saying it's a fully warm peace, especially in the aftermath of October 7th, but that might be the closest one that gets there. Other end of the spectrum, we have, states of war where you actually have not just a lack of full recognition, but actually, sides shooting at each other. Certainly, this would qualify with something like Israel and Syria, or Israel and Iran for sure, which again, not an Arab state, but a Muslim majority state. Israeli-Palestinian, you could kind of put in this box, but I put it in here purposely because you could actually push the Israeli-Palestinian one to the bottom left box and say, well, guess what? After Oslo, the PLO and the PA did recognize Israel. Israel did recognize the PLO and PA, even though they didn't recognize a Palestinian state. So in that sense, maybe it's more like a cold peace. But again, it's tough to use the term peace these days when we talk about Israeli and Palestinian relations. Now, there are examples like Israel-Egypt or Israel-Jordan, which would qualify as a cold peace in the sense that there is full recognition between the two states and their governments. They have exchanged ambassadors, but there is very little travel, little trade, and little good feeling between the countries, which is one of the reasons we call it a cold peace. Upper right is almost a null set. It's very rare in international politics that the people get along swimmingly, but the countries don't and don't recognize each other. So that almost never happens. It would be kind of like a warring brothers scenario. And I don't really see examples like that. In fact, in the Middle East, in particular with Israel, it's usually the opposite in the sense that majorities of the people and pretty much all of Israel's neighbors are not supportive of Israel and or don't want their countries to normalize relations with it. But sometimes the governments do so anyway because they think it's in the interests of their state, or otherwise they feel like they should lead their people in that direction. So that's something that we'll focus on today. All right, so when we think about countries that do have normalized relations with Israel, there's 6 of them, give or take, today. So Egypt first in 1979, 1980, Jordan in 94, and then in 2020, 4 other countries, Bahrain, United Arab Emirates, Morocco, and Sudan. And to be fair, I'm not sure if I would even count Sudan these days. They keep making intentions towards full normalization, but as I can even talk about a bit, they've kind of backed off a little bit or otherwise haven't taken the final steps, in part because they have an ongoing civil war in their country. And also, after they did sign some initial deals, they wanted some military equipment or technology from the Israelis, which they didn't exactly get. They actually kind of renormalized relations with Iran, and that obviously causes some tension there. So some of these are pretty solidly signed and agreed to normalization deals, but some like Sudan are not fully there. And in a sense, that's not necessarily an anomaly. So when we look worldwide at which countries have recognized and have relationships with Israel and have recognized and have relationships with Palestine or with the PLO and PA, we can see there's wide variation. So countries that are in tan recognize both states. And again, even though we only have really a state of Israel in terms of its actual autonomy and existence, a majority of UN member states do recognize Palestine as a state. They give it kind of an observer status at the UN. And so again, tan are countries that do both. Light blue, like the US, are ones that recognize Israel and have some relations to the Palestinians, usually via the PLO and PA, even though they don't recognize yet a Palestinian state. Then you have countries in orange that are kind of the reverse. They recognize Palestine and have some relations with Israel, like Venezuela or Mali. And then in a broader sense, you have some countries that are in red there, which is in fact the majority of Arab countries and Middle East, North African countries that only recognize Palestine and have no recognition or relations with Israel. Now, when we think about normalization, sometimes we think, oh, well, looking at this prior chart, it just kind of increases over time. It's maybe a slow march, but it's like, okay, there's Egypt, then another decade and a half, then there's Jordan, then 2.5 decades of these 4 other Arab states. Like this is the way it's just going to go over time. And I want to tell you that that's not guaranteed. This is a chart that shows countries that have withdrawn their recognition of Israel or suspended or cut ties. And we see a number of examples, right? So fully withdrawing recognition, we have countries like Cuba and Iran, but then other countries like Mauritania there in red, or Colombia and Bolivia in recent years, are countries that have, significantly suspended or cut ties with Israel. Why would they do this? Well, you can just read the news from the past year. So these are some headlines talking about Bolivia and Colombia cutting ties with Israel as a result of the situation in Gaza and Israel's invasion of Gaza in the aftermath of October 7th. And if you think this is a unique thing time-wise, look at this headline. This is from an Israeli newspaper talking about Mauritania cutting its ties. And it says, quote, Muslim state expelled Israeli diplomats and closed the embassy last March over Gaza war. So you might think, oh, okay, kind of same thing going on now. But then you look at the date and it's like, no, this is actually 2010. So again, there have been multiple clashes in and around Gaza. There have been rockets fired from Gaza into Israel. There have been Israeli military invasions and incursions and strikes into Gaza. So in a broader sense, this has been one of the key sticking points for why countries are not normalizing, but actually kind of denormalizing or breaking ties as a result of, violence and conflict in the region. So when we think about normalization with Israel, we actually need to think about it going potentially in both directions, depending on the situation and the politics of the time. So let's just spend a little bit talking about why this happens before we go into present day issues and what might happen next under a new Trump administration. So from a political science perspective, there's actually a lot of good research on why countries make normalization deals or recognize each other, as well as why it doesn't occur. So let's go through just 5 of them real quick in a couple groups. First is lack of misperception. So there's a great deal of misperception in international politics. Countries constantly don't know what are the intentions of the other side, what is their relative strength or ability to fight or beat me on the battlefield, what is actually my relative strength or will about how much I'm willing to fight over this issue. So to the extent you have less misperception, it makes it more likely that you'll have normalization, in part because it doesn't necessarily mean that countries have to be equal, but if each side kind of recognizes, okay, you're not going anywhere and I can't fully defeat you, so maybe therefore it's worth normalizing relations with you, like that can make it more likely. Also, leadership. When we think about countries that have had full normalization in terms of countries that border Israel or live among Israelis, there's 3 examples, right? Egypt, Jordan, and then to some extent the Palestinians with the Oslo Accords. Okay, in 2 out of those 3 scenarios, one of the leaders was killed by a member of their own community for signing that deal. So in terms of Israel, Egypt, Anwar Sadat lost his life soon after signing the peace treaty with Israel. In terms of Israelis and Palestinians, Yitzhak Rabin was killed by an Israeli not too long after signing and then continuing to negotiate the Oslo Accords. So Israel, Jordan is the only scenario where you haven't had that, and you actually could qualify it because Yitzhak Rabin signed a peace deal with Jordan in 94, not too long before he was assassinated. So leadership in terms of people who are risk acceptant and willing to recognize that signing a peace treaty between Israel and surrounding Arab countries can be quite sensitive for each population that's involved. So you have to have individuals that are willing to accept personal risks, as well as potentially visionaries about recognizing that maybe in the longer run, this is actually better for our people and peace in the region, as well as for, me as a leader maybe and my country. So thinking about some of this historically, no countries in the region, no Arab countries in the region recognized Israel when it was founded in 1948. In fact, most of them fought a war to try to prevent that from happening. And then after another war in 1967, when Israel conquered East Jerusalem, the West Bank, the Golan Heights, and Syria, all of the Arab states came together actually at a meeting in Sudan at Khartoum and agreed to the 3 no's. Basically, no peace with Israel, no recognizing Israel, and no negotiations with Israel. And some of that was also designed to kind of have a unified front, so no country would kind of sign their own individual deal to get something from the Israelis, but then to kind of sell out the Palestinians or the rest of the broader Arab cause. So this is how things were for about 2 decades or a decade and a half or so, a little bit under. But then we have the momentum towards Camp David, where there's actually a surprise attack and a war launched by Syria and Egypt in 73, which kind of opens some Israeli eyes to the fact that they're not invincible. In some ways, a predecessor to October 7th, which happens almost exactly 50 years later. And then we have a series of years of negotiations where Anwar Sadat takes a number of very brave steps, flying to Ben Gurion Airport and making a speech in front of the Israeli Knesset, pushing for peace, even though at that time he's basically like the de facto head of the Arab League as the head of the most populous and powerful Arab state of Egypt. He takes great personal risk to do so. Menachem Begin, who is the leader of Herut, a right-wing party, the first one to lead Israel, also takes steps to withdraw Israel entirely from the Sinai, including removing some Israeli settlements that were there. Jimmy Carter puts a lot of his political capital and effort into it, and we get this picture on the bottom left where these countries normalize relations, which have lasted to this day throughout multiple other wars, revolutions, etc. in the region. Israel and Egypt have largely demilitarized their borders and have not fought a war after having fought four major wars between 1948 and 1973. You could also say that kind of lack of misperception or lessening of it made a difference in Israeli-Palestinian relations. So after the early days of the first Intifada, where you had a large kind of grassroots uprising across the West Bank and Gaza against the Israeli military occupation, you had leaders like Yitzhak Rabin, before he was prime minister, saying, quote, "I've learned something in the past 2.5 months. Among other things, you can't rule by force over 1.5 million Palestinians." So even though Rabin himself is a famous Israeli military leader, he was certainly no, peacenik who was just trying to give everything to the Palestinians. He said, look, I've recognized as a result of the Intifada that we can't, ad infinitum forever just rule over the Palestinians by force. There has to be some type of agreement and recognition here. It's one of the reasons that, again, somewhat unwillingly, but nonetheless he did it, shook hands with Arafat on the White House lawn and ultimately recognized the PLO as the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinians. Two other factors that drive normalization. One is two-level games, the idea that when you're making a deal between countries, which is one level, you also have two other deals and negotiations going on, which is internally inside each country, can that leadership get their people on board with it? Because if they don't, it can be more difficult to reach a deal. Also, there are always going to be actors, whether it's political leaders or members of armed or terrorist groups or otherwise, who want to prevent these deals from happening because they think it's a bad deal or it's traitorous or they themselves personally or as an organization aren't going to benefit from it. So they try to take various actions, sometimes violent ones, to prevent the negotiations from being successful, right? So when we think about two-level games, we can think of it in a schematic like this. And again, if we think about this in the Israeli-Palestinian context, if you have Arafat and Rabin who are negotiating, that's one level of negotiation. But then they also have the Israeli and Palestinian people who they kind of need to get on board to make this deal or negotiate it. Otherwise, they're putting themselves at great personal risk, and they're also risking the fact that the deal is not going to be upheld by any future government or leader. And so when you have some support, you can get things like this. At the same time, if you have individuals or organizations that are, launching violent attacks or taking territory that is owned by people from the other side or otherwise, that can spoil and prevent negotiations from working because when there's a Hamas suicide bombing, the Israeli public is not in the mood to go and, make concessions towards the Palestinians. When there's an attack by an Israeli settler against Palestinians, the Palestinians are in the mood to make concessions towards the Israelis. And again, some of the people and organizations who do this know that. It's one of the reasons that they launch attacks or they do these things because they want to spoil the deal from happening and prevent normalization. Final one I'll talk about is third-party guarantors. So one of the classic things we mention in international relations is something called the commitment problem. And the commitment problem is the idea that you and I can sign an agreement, but how do I then know that you'll uphold your end of the bargain? Maybe you'll just take the things that I'm giving you and you won't give me the things that you agreed to give me. So let's take this like, I'm buying, something on eBay or something. It's like, okay, I'm buying a coat from you. And so I send you the money. And then there's a commitment problem in terms of like, well, will you actually ship me the coat or will you just keep my money? Now, when we live in the United States or most countries in the world, it's not an anarchy. So if you didn't ship the coat to me, I can sue you or I can ask eBay to ban you or otherwise. So there's things that can be enforced upon you to pressure you to kind of send me the coat. And if it's somehow not what you pictured, I can, have recourse. International politics doesn't really have that. There's no international world government. The UN exists, but it doesn't have many teeth. It doesn't have its own standing army or anything like that. So a lot of international scholars say, there's anarchy in the international system. Everyone's kind of fighting for themselves and having to take care of their own issues. And so there's commitment problems when you do something like a normalization deal where it's like, well, I might recognize you, but then are you going to do the things that I'm asking you to do? Or are you going to take that recognition and then just do things that upset me or anger me? And then, either I don't have recourse or I guess I could pull back my recognition, but that's not what I want to do either. So having a powerful third party that can offer carrots and sticks to bring the parties to the table, but also get them to agree to the deal and then hold up their ends of the bargain is really important. It's not a coincidence that in all of these pictures between Israelis and Palestinians, Israelis and Egyptians, Israelis and Bahrainis and Emiratis, you see the American president there in the middle because the US has classically acted as the third party guarantor for all of these parties, not just kind of pushing them and using leverage to bring them to the table, but also providing economic incentives for them to sign deals and keep deals, as well as military incentives both to support them, but also leverage that if they don't follow through, they may lose aid or support from the United States. And so that makes a big difference in terms of normalization happening. In fact, and again, this is something that one of my colleagues and friends, Greg Gause, excellent professor, I think, maybe the best scholar in terms of Saudi relations and Saudi policy, will often say is that Arab normalization deals with Israel are really deals with the United States. And here's what he and I kind of mean by that, which is if you look at the concessions that are given or used to get parties to the table to normalize with Israel, the majority of them come from the United States, as do the majority of the incentives to kind of join the US alliance structure. So let's take Morocco, going left from right. Morocco in 2020 signed the Abraham Accords. What's the big thing that happened? It's not like all of a sudden Israel had some new government that the Moroccans really loved when they didn't love them before. One of the big things that happened is President Trump said, the U.S. will recognize Moroccan claims to the Western Sahara, this disputed territory to the south of Morocco that Morocco has been fighting a war on for decades now, trying to control it and say it's their country. So getting the U.S. to do that was the major domino that got the Moroccans to sign on the dotted line. What about Sudan? Okay, Sudan didn't no longer want it to be on the U.S. terrorist state sponsors of terrorism list. And so the Trump administration basically said to them, if you pay off this, the judgment here, then we'll kind of take you off the list. And then you'll have, stronger support from the United States and the Israelis going forward. The Sudanese kind of agreed to do so. But then, as I mentioned, they backtrack a bit because they haven't gotten the exact stuff that they were hoping for. And now they're fighting an ongoing civil war. So they're a little bit more in between. The Emirates and Bahrain already have large U.S. military bases there, naval bases, air bases, strongly have put themselves in the American camp. They want U.S. support to guarantee their regime's security vis-a-vis Iran or others who might try to replace them. And so in a broad sense, signing on the dotted line with Israel, yes, they have some mutual interest with Israel, which includes balancing against Iran and otherwise, but being part of the U.S. sphere of influence and alliance structure is incredibly valuable to them. And it's one of the key reasons that they signed on to the Abraham Accords. You can make similar arguments for Egypt and Jordan, right? Both of them made decisions, Sadat in particular, saying, Egypt went back and forth for a while under Nasser between the Soviet sphere, the American sphere, the unaligned sphere. But ultimately, Sadat made the decision, like, for the future of our country, being in the American sphere is the way to go for us. And also, and again, this is the area the Israelis gave the biggest concession. We get the entirety of the Sinai back, which Israel had controlled since 1967. So it's not that Israel doesn't make any concessions in these deals. They do make some, but the majority of the concessions and incentives are coming from the United States. And that's important to keep in mind going forward if you're thinking about the Saudis or others in terms of actually getting another normalization agreement. So let's talk about what's happened recently and what may come. So this, again, is a picture from the Abraham Accords in 2020, on the last year of the previous Trump presidency, when he's getting a number of Arab states to sign on to normalization agreements with the Israelis. In terms of reaction in the region, it was mixed. On the one hand, this is a former Israeli Prime Minister, Naftali Bennett, being welcomed to the Bahrain, to the royal palace, where they're playing Hatikva, which is the Israeli national anthem, and again has strong resonance for the Jewish people. In the Emirates, you have museums that are talking about Jewish culture and heritage, and even talking about stuff related to the Holocaust and the history of Jewish relations in a positive way with Arab and Muslim populations. But then, you also have increases in trade, which makes a difference. So in the case of the UAE, you can see just in a few years, the amount of trade that they had with Israel outstripped that with Egypt and Jordan, that had been, partners with Israel, at least normalization partners with Israel for decades. So in some sense, that's why I mentioned the UAE is the one that's maybe going the closest to a warmer peace. But then you also have a number of countries who denounced these deals, right? There was the Qataris, the Palestinians themselves, the Iranians, who of course are not an Arab country, but are an important Muslim country in the region, the Iraqis. So you still have a majority of countries in the region who are against normalization with Israel until if and when you have a Palestinian state, which we'll talk about. But you do have a number of countries that did sign on a dotted line and have held it despite what's been happening over the past year. Now, other important developments. We had a normalization agreement of sorts, or a renormalization agreement of sorts, between Saudi and Iran. So, as you may know, over the past decade or so, the Saudis and the Iranians have been vying for regional hegemony. They've been fighting a variety of proxy wars in Yemen, in Iraq, and Syria to varying degrees. And especially Mohammed bin Salman, the de facto or, really de facto crown prince leader of Saudi Arabia, he's kind of wanted to tone down those civil wars. They haven't necessarily gone Saudi's way, tone down the rhetoric and some of the costly violence and otherwise that's happened with Iran. I don't think the Saudis and Iranians are about to be best friends by any means, but you do see kind of a renormalization of relations between those countries. And very interesting in this picture, it's not the American president there in the middle, right? It's a Chinese official. And that's important because that's another big change over the past 10 years or so, is that China has increasingly gotten involved in the Middle East, not just in terms of investment, but also in terms of purchasing significant oil from Iran and other countries. And this was a little bit of a thumb in the eye by the Saudis to the Americans by saying, hey, we have other options here. If you're going to criticize us on our human rights record or things like this, like the Chinese aren't going to do that. They just want to work with us economically and otherwise. So maybe this is ultimately the party that will be in all these pictures and kind of shepherding through and being a third party guarantor. So this brings us to maybe the biggest piece of foreign policy legislation for the U.S. that was negotiated over in the Biden administration, and I guarantee you in some form will be negotiated over in the coming Trump administration, which is the potential for Saudi normalization. Before October 7th, the Biden administration was pushing a kind of U.S.-Saudi-Israeli treaty that some people liken to like a Middle Eastern NATO of sorts. And in terms of what NATO is, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which is based largely in Europe, the idea was kind of in a pithy statement, keep the U.S. in, because there was some concern that the United States would leave Europe after World War II, just as it left it after World War I, leaving the Western Europe vulnerable. To who? To the Soviets, who the Red Army had rolled all the way into East Germany. And so there was some concern they would keep rolling to West Germany and then into Western Europe. So NATO was designed to balance against the Soviets. And then finally, the Germans, who were seen as being responsible for two previous world wars, the idea was to kind of keep them down and keep them weaker. That's what NATO is all about. So to some extent, you could say this potential alliance is similar. It's like there's some concern in the region that the U.S. is going to retrench and pull back from the Middle East. There's concern that China and Russia are getting more involved, so kind of keep them more out, and then certainly keep Iran down. That's in many ways the most common thing that the Israelis, the Americans, the Emiratis, the Bahrainis, and to some extent the Saudis as well, all have in their interest arsenal, so to speak. So this would be the basis of it. And having Israel and Saudi normalize would not just be those countries now normalize relations, but it would be part of this broader kind of Abraham Accords, especially like Israel and Gulf alliance that's been behind the scenes for a while, but now would be much more public to both balance against Iran and pursue joint interests. Now, when the Trump administration comes in, there's some history here, right? Which is previously he pulled the U.S. out of the Iran nuclear deal, which the Obama administration had signed. The Biden administration tried to negotiate back into a version of it, but it never was able to do so. But long and short, the Trump administration is certainly going to be well on board with any anti-Iranian balancing and potentially even open to, direct attacks against Iran by Israel and or the United States. But the challenge is, what do you do given the past year? So the Biden administration after October 7th recognized that the Saudis are not about to sign a normalization agreement with Israel while you have the invasion of Gaza, the large loss of life there, and the almost universal condemnation from the broader Arab world of Israeli behavior. So what did the U.S. do under Biden? They continued to negotiate just directly with the Saudis and said, okay, what about a multi-stage process whereby the U.S. gives you all of these goodies off the bat? We're going to give you regime security and mutual defense guarantees. We're going to give the Saudis access to more weaponry. The Saudis are going to allow to have a civilian nuclear program that the U.S. will sanction. In exchange, the Saudis will agree to not have significant or any Chinese arms purchases or more significant investment. And then once this current conflict winds down, that's when the Saudis will normalize with the Israelis. And then ultimately, there will be commitment towards resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the emergence of a Palestinian state, which is a key Saudi precondition. So that's what the Biden administration was pushing. Again, it did not happen. It is not going to happen before the Biden administration leaves office. But the Trump administration will pick up and try to pursue something like this, I can pretty much guarantee. And we can see some background here. So Trump has talked about this before. In fact, he would have loved to have had this in the previous round of the Abraham Accords, but in some ways, the Saudis see themselves as kind of a broader leader of the region. So they probably looked at the Emiratis and Bahraini signing as kind of like a trial balloon, like let's see how it goes, and let's see how the broader region reacts before we sign on. Trump can not incorrectly say that he has a better personal relationship with Mohammed bin Salman than the Biden administration did. Biden obviously criticized MBS for the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, as well as a number of other issues. Trump administration and President Trump is much less likely to do that, has more affinity with more authoritarian leaders. And so in that broad sense, it's not wrong to say there's a personal relationship there. The challenge, I think, comes in the sense that I think President Trump will be willing to do some of the transactional stuff of saying, okay, give you greater arms sales, maybe a civilian nuclear program, normalize with Israel, et cetera. But kind of a regime security guarantee is the exact type of thing that he doesn't necessarily like so much about NATO, alongside kind of the disproportionate spending of the US. So the terms that he offers may be a little bit different than the Biden administration, although he may well try to guarantee the Saud's monarchy regime security. But long and short, this is something that the Trump administration, I think, very likely will push for in the next 4 years. The Israelis are certainly open to it. Netanyahu has said after the war ends, he's interested in pursuing deals with more Arab countries. That's long been his policy, is basically put negotiations and deals with the Palestinians on the back burner, instead kind of go over their heads and negotiate directly with Arab states, both to get those normalization deals, but also to weaken the Palestinian bargaining position. But there have been some roadblocks that have come up recently. One of the ones that just from a couple of days ago, Mohammed bin Salman said in a speech that what Israel is doing in Gaza is genocide. Now, that's in line with what many Palestinians and many Arabs in the region have been saying, but it's also something that the vast majority of Israelis not only don't agree with, but take great offense at. And so whether that will be water under the bridge in a year or two, I don't know, but it's certainly an indicator that Mohammed bin Salman didn't slip that word out. He certainly thought about saying it before he did. And it shows, some animosity and criticism, certainly with Israel right now, which is not necessarily conducive to a broader normalization agreement. Perhaps more significant and serious, though, is the fact that when you've seen speeches, and again, you can watch these on video, of the Saudi foreign minister, Prince Faisal, pictured here, says, hey, we've got a great relationship with the Americans, but we will not normalize with the Israelis without a Palestinian state. Sometimes the Saudis have implied that like the state has to be in existence. Other times they've said a little less and said, no, we just need kind of an agreement that can't be reneged upon, that will walk to a Palestinian state, and then we'll normalize with Israel. But they are not saying that they'll do it without it. And that's certainly what Netanyahu and the Israelis would like. They would like to have normalization and then no Palestinian statehood. But the Saudis are saying, no, 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 you have to have statehood and Palestinian statehood and steps towards it if you want normalization. We'll talk about that linkage in just a moment. So if we're setting odds for this stuff, I can pretty much guarantee there will be efforts under the Trump administration to make this happen, but it's less likely than it was certainly a year or two ago, given what's happened over the past year with, massive loss of life and growing animosity in the region vis-a-vis the Israelis. So let's build on that just a little bit. In terms of the two-state solution prereq that the Saudis have been saying, that fits a lot of the broader international community. The Biden administration has said this is the time to do it. The UAE has linked to the two-state solution for helping to rebuild Gaza after the war. But the Israelis, especially the current Israeli government, has gone in precisely the opposite direction. So Netanyahu, whereas previously he would kind of play little games here and there and say, yeah, I support a Palestinian state. And he rarely said that, but he said it in a speech here and there. But then you look at the specifics of it and it's kind of less than a state. Now he pretty avowedly says there will be no Palestinian state. I don't support a Palestinian state. And in fact, the Israeli Knesset, he's not alone, voted to say there is not going to be a Palestinian state. And it was not just him and members of, the national religious, more far right parties. There were centrists and others who voted this way as well, basically saying, look, after October 7th is not the time to have a reward for the Palestinian cause to have a state. That being said, it's interesting to look at Americans, because even amidst everything that's going on in 2024, you still get a majority of Americans who say that they favor the establishment of an independent Palestinian state on the West Bank and Gaza. So interesting combination here where the Saudis are saying you have to have a Palestinian state, a two-state solution to get normalization. A majority of Americans agree that this should be a goal. but then majority of Israelis do not. And actually, if I pulled up the public opinion polls I showed you in prior talks, a majority of Palestinians also say they don't support a two-state solution, but it's not because they don't support a Palestinian state. They just don't think that it's actually viable or going to happen, or they think that maybe they want more than just a state on the West Bank and Gaza. So in any case, there's great international push for a Palestinian state and two-state solution, but among Israelis and Palestinians, there's less of that support. So what does the incoming president think about this stuff? He was interviewed, and now this is in the past year, so after October 7th. Do you think an outcome of that war between Israel and Hamas should be a two-state solution between Israelis and Palestinians? Trump said, quote, most people thought it was going to be a two-state solution. I'm not sure a two-state solution anymore is going to work. There was a time when I thought two states could work. Now I think two states is going to be very, very tough. I think it's going to be much tougher to get. And then you have one of his advisors, Keith Kellogg, basically castigating other states like Ireland, Spain, and Norway when they recognized the state of Palestine recently, and also said that allies shouldn't be encouraged to do that. So at least in the Trump administration, it seems like the wind is blowing against a two-state solution. Now, let's give a little bit more context there. This is Trump's deal of the century that he and Jared Kushner pushed the last time that he was in office. Now, on the one hand, it's important to note he presented this as a two-state solution. So you can see on the map provided here, green, which is here, is a future state of Palestine. So he said, look, this is a two-state solution. There'll be a state of Palestine in green alongside a state of Israel in this kind of tannish color. That being said, the Palestinians generally rejected this because they looked at the map and they said, this is a non-contiguous mess. This isn't a true state. Yes, there's a tunnel between the West Bank and Gaza, but the entire Jordan Valley, we're surrounded by Israel on all sides. There's huge chunks taken away from, our land. And so Palestinians didn't even really engage seriously on this stuff. Netanyahu said yes, but kind of a yes, but. And then a lot of the more right-wing politicians like Ben-Gvir and Smotrich actually denounced this and said they don't accept it because it has a Palestinian state and they want to annex some or all of the West Bank. So all of this is to say, this could be revived in some form. I wouldn't be surprised for the Trump administration to talk about this again or try to push it again, and maybe in some form or basis. But ultimately, from his quotes, it seems like he's moving kind of up the chain here from a two-state solution that nonetheless is a very Israeli favorable one to actually more like the one-state solution from the Israeli perspective, which is going to be more Israel as it is, maybe annexing some of the West Bank, and then maybe greater Palestinian autonomy in some form, but maybe not statehood. So at least that's what he and some of his advisors are implying. Whether that will happen, we'll see. But let's talk about that in context of something really important, which his administration will definitely face in the next 4 years, which is not just the issue of normalization with the Saudis or other Arab states, but also the issue of annexation of the West Bank in particular, but maybe also the Gaza Strip. So let's talk about how this has been handled historically, because each side kind of has a different way that they talk about it. There's something called the Arab Peace Initiative, and I wouldn't be surprised if you have never heard of it before, but it's somewhat of a big deal. Back in 2002, the Saudis actually pushed this agreement where they said, we will recognize Israel, we will normalize relations with it, we will guarantee its security. And by the way, not just us, every single other Arab state, the entire Arab League agreed to this back in 2002. And also, by the way, pretty much every country of the Organization of Islamic Conference, so all the Muslim majority states minus Iran, has agreed to this. So all these states that are on that map previously, like not recognizing Israel, not normalizing with Israel, all saying, actually, we are willing to recognize Israel and normalize with Israel. The key is, of course, what are the conditions? And they say, well, the conditions are Israel has to withdraw from the West Bank and Gaza, the territory that it conquered in the 1967 war. If it does that and allows a Palestinian state to emerge in the West Bank and Gaza, which again includes East Jerusalem, then these states will recognize Israel and the conflict will be over and all relations will be normalized. So what they're really saying is, if you don't annex the West Bank and Gaza and instead withdraw, then we will all normalize with you. So that's kind of the linkage between annexation and normalization. Don't do annexation, and then there'll be normalization. The Israelis, particularly the Netanyahu government, look at it quite a bit differently. They basically say, you need to either normalize with us, or we will push forward with annexation potentially. And we've seen this in quotes. So Smotrich, who is the finance minister, in many ways controls a lot of the Israeli levers in the West Bank, said Trump's victory is an opportunity to, quote, apply sovereignty in the West Bank. And he says even more explicitly to annex the West Bank. So that's what he's lining up to do. And again, this is not a new idea for him. This is something he's always wanted to do, but now he thinks there's more of an opportunity and support from a Trump administration versus a Biden administration. And I think he's probably right about that. Israel just switched their ambassador to the United States to this guy pictured here, Leiter. He is someone who has been a settler leader who will absolutely advocate for not only the spread of settlements, but annexation potentially of settlements in the West Bank and the broader West Bank. And then the Trump administration, just the past day or two, announced who their ambassador to Israel will be, which is Mike Huckabee. And guess what? He is someone who has been on the record saying, there's no such thing as a Palestinian. I don't believe in something called the West Bank. I use the terms Judea and Samaria. There's no such thing as settlements. These are communities. So again, the language that he's signaling from years ago strongly signals that he would be quite supportive of annexation. Now, to be clear, the ambassador doesn't make policy, carries out the president's policy. But the fact that Trump is nominating him to be ambassador, again, is another tea leaf that's putting things that in a line where it's like U.S. ambassador to Israel, Israel ambassador to U.S., major Israeli officials, former president, now new president again, Trump's statements, all lining up to the point that it seems like annexation may be in the offing and may be supported potentially by the United States, or at least not criticized or pushed back upon. Now, the link between annexation and normalization is not a new one. Again, not just the Arab Peace Initiative in 2002, but also you can just go back 4 years ago. So this is Yosef Al-Otaiba, a very important official in the United Arab Emirates, actually published an article in Hebrew in Ynet, basically one of the major Israeli media outlets, saying it is impossible to annex and continue to hope for a good relationship with the Arab world. So basically saying to the Israelis, if you annex the West Bank, you can't then have normalization with Arab countries and the rest of the Arab world. And again, this is from one of the leaders of the United Arab Emirates, the most kind of warm peace, eventually, country that was favorably inclined to the Israelis. So one of the things that the Emirates got out of their normalization agreement with the Israelis in 2020 was a statement from Netanyahu that they will not annex the West Bank. That being said, it was time limited. And this has kind of come out recently that the Emiratis said, actually, there was only a commitment that Israel would annex the West Bank until 2024. Well, guess what year we're in now and about to pass through. So he, had an interview where he's basically warning and saying, we did what we could to prevent annexation and maintain the possibility of a state of Palestine, but the agreement the Israelis gave us is kind of running out. And so our leverage here is declining. So that's something to kind of keep an eye on and think about here. Now, thinking about this in the context of other border states, again, Emiratis not being a border state, but in terms of those that are, like Jordan, this is the handshake between Rabin and King Hussein back in 1994, where Jordan normalizes relations with the Israelis, which they've maintained to this day. But just to give you a sense of some of the obstacles to future normalization, again, you can just check out this link and see this little speech. It's about 2 minutes long by the Jordanian foreign minister. And again, this is being tweeted by the Jordanian foreign ministry. Basically making the case for the Arab Peace Initiative, but saying in very, very harsh and direct terms, like, we are the ones who are the partners for peace, not the Israelis. Like, we are saying, we will all recognize you. We will all right now guarantee your security. We'll normalize with you. All you need to do is pull back from this land that, according to international law, you're not allowed to control because you gained it in a war in 1967. And so we're the ones who are ready for peace. When Netanyahu says there's no partner for peace, that's wrong. We're all ready to be peaceful partners. We're ready to recognize you. You just have to take this step that the broader international community says that you need to do, and we'll sign on the deal. This, again, is a marked change because historically, Jordan has been one of the most, pro-Israel, or at least less anti-Israel states in its policy, all the way going back to the founding of Israel in 1948, when there's a number of scholars who have written about, kind of secret negotiations between Israelis and Jordanians, because neither of them really liked Palestinian nationalism. And certainly the Jordanians faced their own challenges there with Black September in 1970 and other issues. So in the broad sense, seeing Jordan go from a country that generally has had pretty good relationships with Israel historically to incredibly deteriorated ones where you have this ambassador calling what's going on in Gaza a catastrophe, pulling out from economic agreements with the Israelis. You see Bahrain recalling their ambassador. You see the Moroccans having protests and statements against Israel. The past year has really, really degraded Israel's standing and relations in the region, and you can see that in polls. So this is already where things were in 2022 in terms of whether people saw the Palestinian cause as not just a Palestinian one, but also an Arab cause. So that's in blue. So this goes to the idea that, again, for most Arabs in the region in particular, they don't just see the Palestinian issue as a uniquely Palestinian one, they see it as a broader Arab one. When we look now the past year, so again, this is after October 7th and the Israeli invasion of Gaza, people being asked about the prospects for peace based on what's happened with the war, the most common answer in the majority for pretty much every other country is, I have become certain that there will be no possibility for peace with Israel, like no possibility. And then you could say, okay, well, there's these other answers here. Okay, red is, I believe that even before the war, there was no possibility for peace with Israel. So if you combine the dark blue and the red, those are people who believe there will never be peace with Israel. Some believed it before, some believe it now because of the past year. Then the light blue isn't so great either for normalization. I have serious doubts about the possibility for peace with Israel. So really, if you want to add up the red, the light blue, and the dark blue, those are all people who pretty much think slim to no chance of peace with Israel. The only people who think that there's still a possibility are kind of this pinkish here, which, as you can see, makes up no more than a fifth and often a tenth of populations. So it doesn't mean that you need a majority of a population to say, yes, I believe in peace or I believe in normalization to make it happen. In fact, almost every normalization agreement, if not all of them that have been signed with Israel, have been done by governments above the objections of their people, or at least above the public opinion of their people, the majority of whom don't support it. And the proof in the pudding of that is, look at the countries here. Literally, the one that believes the least in peace is Jordan. This is a country that has normalization with Israel and recognizes Israel. Look at Egypt, right? So for even countries that have peace deals with Israel, look at this one. This is even more direct. Recognition of Israel by country. Should there be recognition of Israel by country? So yeah, 99% Libya, no. But okay, let's look at countries that literally have deals with the Israelis. Egypt, 89% of Egyptians say their country should not recognize Israel. Again, definition of cold peace here. Only 4% of Jordanians say their country should recognize Israel. Again, a country that has a deal with the Israelis. Same with the Moroccans. So when we think about the Saudis, we see with Saudi, interesting anomaly, at least outlier here, almost 30% of people saying don't know or decline to answer. That may be because either they support having the deal or they think their country's going to do it and they don't want to be found out that they answered negatively and face some political or criminal problems. But in a broad sense, if this is the public opinion ratings for how many people want to have recognition of Israel normalization, that's a very significant headwind. And this is probably the major reason that momentum for Saudi-Israeli normalization has, dissipated, to say the least, since October 7th and the aftermath. Now, can these things change? Sure. If you have the return of the hostages to Israel, if you have the end of the Israeli invasion and bombing of Gaza and the rebuilding of people's homes and lives there, if you have an Israeli withdrawal from Lebanon, the return of Israelis to the north of Lebanon from a lack of rocket fire from Hezbollah, lack of Israeli airstrikes into Lebanon, do I think this is going to flip? No. But do I think that the numbers would change some? Yes. I think that, people always are prisoners of the moment to some extent with these opinions. And right now, this is the deadliest time we've seen in decades in terms of this, broader Israeli-Palestinian and Arab-Israeli conflict. So that's driving some of these percentages. But, I don't necessarily see an end in sight in terms of aspects of the conflict. And so it may stay like this for quite a bit. Now, other things that can play into this a little bit and other tea leaves we can read in terms of what's going to happen going forward. Another appointee that President Trump made is Elise Stefanik to the United Nations. And again, these appointments aren't all confirmed yet, but likely she does go to the UN. And in terms of some of the other things we mentioned in prior talks regarding UNRWA, I can give you almost 100% guarantee that the US will pull all of its aid to UNRWA, in part because the Trump administration did it last time he was in office. So he pulled all the aid to UNRWA. If you don't know what UNRWA is, it's the UN Relief Works Association that it basically provides the vast majority of humanitarian aid and education to Palestinian refugees. The Trump administration pulled it back. The Biden administration reinstated it. I'm pretty sure very early on, if not on the first day or two, the Trump administration will pull it again. That's certainly something that Stefanik has been, somewhat vocal about previously. And then when you add to the fact that the Israeli Knesset has passed laws restricting UN RWA activity, and also produced information that some of them were involved on the October 7th attacks, I think it'll be, again, almost a guarantee that the Trump administration will pull back from funding UNRWA, which again will sour some relations with the Palestinians and then maybe also with some other surrounding states in terms of normalization. So something else to keep an eye on. The final thing I'll say is that we want to make sure we understand the different environment that exists today in the Middle East and North Africa versus what existed in 2016. And to be clear, some of these things are changes of degree, right? Not like total changes. It's not like in 2016, there was not a lot of anti-Israel animosity in the region. There was. But as I think I showed you in some of those charts, it's at almost peak levels these days. And so that's a very different environment than in 2016 or 2020 when Trump was getting the Abraham Accords passed. So in this broad sense, that's something the new Trump administration is going to have to contend with, along with, again, greater solidarity with the Palestinian people among particularly the Arab and Muslim population in the region. Saudi Arabia and Iran were fighting multiple proxy civil wars in the region a little under a decade ago, and most of those wars have wound down or had less kind of Saudi involvement in particular. So that makes things a little bit different, especially for Trump, who is very avowedly anti-Iranian and kind of is organizing and wants to organize the Gulf along those lines. So we'll see how that goes. China was always involved in the Middle East, but again, both politically, diplomatically, and economically, it's more involved than it was before and increasingly presents itself as kind of an alternative of sorts to some of these states that maybe hedge against a bit, either U.S. withdrawal or a lack of U.S. support for them domestically. And then again, this question of normalization or anti-normalization, I think in 2016, it was by no means guaranteed that something like the Abraham Accords would happen, but things were trending more in the direction of more of that as opposed to the opposite. Whereas now, again, as we've seen with Colombia, with Bolivia, with other states, some things have moved against normalization and countries breaking ties. So I think it's a really open question for the next 4 years, whether you'll see greater normalization among Israel and countries in the MENA region, or actually less normalization than we see now. And in aggregate, it kind of has to be one or the other or stay the same. But we may also see some variation. Like it's possible we could see a Saudi deal, but simultaneously the breaking of relations with some other states. So again, not all these countries are the same. They certainly have different populations, opinions, leaders, etc. But hopefully today I've given you some good understanding about why normalization happens and when and why it doesn't happen or when it is removed from the scene. So to close, let me just say a few things. First, if you want to read more about this stuff, again, I commend to you the Arabs and Israelis book, which has both the history of Israeli-Palestinian and Arab-Israeli relations, as well as the different community narratives. If you want to read about U.S. foreign policy involvement in a lot of these negotiations historically, check out Aaron David Miller's book. If you want to read more about relations within the Gulf with Saudi, Iran, Iraq, etc., then I think Greg Gall's book, International Relations of the Persian Gulf, is a great one. As I always mention, you don't have to read Hebrew or Arabic to be able to read local news in this region. It will expose you to many more stories of different types and different perspectives than you had before. You certainly don't have to agree with them all. There's no way you possibly could. You will hate some of them and disagree with them, but it will enrich your understanding of different people's perspective. And even if you're trying very hard to advocate for a pro-Israeli or pro-Palestinian position, understanding how other community lives, sees things, experiences things, can help you. Because at the end of the day, unless your goal is, full ethnic cleansing or extermination of the 7 million of the other population that lives between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, there has to be a way for these populations and certainly the broader Israeli, Jewish, and Arab population in the region to get along alongside the Israeli and Palestinian populations. So understanding different people's perspectives and experiences, I think, is an important prereq to be doing so. And I know almost all of us on here are not policymakers in any case. So hopefully, at least in our communities, understanding this stuff can help us with our conversations, advocacy, etc. The final thing I want to say, because I know a lot of these talks are, not necessarily very hopeful in the sense that this is a very dark time. Like there are thousands of people who are losing their lives. There are people being held hostage. There are people among Israelis and Palestinians and Lebanese, like most of these populations feel tremendous stress these days and concern about their family's future and their lives day to day. And there's no way to avoid that. And that's why when I do these talks, I don't sugarcoat things. I try to tell you exactly the way things are. But I also know that we're human beings. And, I don't think I would have gotten into being a professor and a facilitator on these issues if I didn't ultimately have some hope that things can be better than they are now. And so that's kind of one of the things I want to end on and saying to all of you is that I know whatever your political leanings are and whatever your personal connections or affinity are to this broader conflict in the broader region, you would like things to be better and different than they are now. I don't think there's anyone watching this video who says, yes, this is the way I envision things being. This is the way I want them to be. I think it's a failure for everybody, and it's a failure for whatever community you're supporting here or care about. And it could be you care about all of these communities. So the hopeful note I have is twofold. Number one, this conflict in the way it is now will not last forever. And if we look at times in which there are peace agreements or people recognizing there needs to be a change, whether it's a change in terms of who's leading some of these countries or a change in terms of how these countries interact or what's happened, that usually comes after conflict. And so I don't think we should have conflict to make these pieces happen. I hope we could avoid it. But given that it's occurred and it wakes people up to some of the challenges and problems, and we don't want to have that happen again, that's something that there'll be an opportunity that comes after this. And I will tell you that from the facilitations I do and the many talks I do in different communities, both Palestinian, Israeli, and American, I know that there's a new generation of people who have credibility in their communities, who have knowledge, and want there to be a better future, both for their people and for the broader region. And it's a very open question about whether they'll be able to take it and make things better and different than they are now. But if I look for hope, that's where I find it. And if you're sitting here watching and hoping that things will be different, then I hope that you're ready and you're armed with some of the knowledge that I'm trying to give you, and hopefully others are as well. So when the time comes to make different policy or do things better and different, you'll know how to do so, and you'll have some better understanding about how other people can be worked with or engaged with to make that happen. So that's the hopeful note I end on. I want to thank again the MENA MIT program, David Dolev and Rich Nielsen in particular, for helping to invite me and set this all up. I think it's a great new initiative at MIT to spread knowledge and understanding about the Middle East, North Africa region. I encourage you to go to their website to check out their other great publications and videos. And I hope I'm back again sometime soon to engage with all of you. So thank you again so much. I hope you have a good weekend. Stay safe. And let's all pray and hope that the next time I see you, things are better in the MENA region. See you later.